Kenya, can we test?
Yeah, good morning.
Good morning. You are loud and clear. Ireland, Excellency,
Yeah,
can we test with you?
yeah, this is Ireland. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Great, thank you.
Good morning. UNODC.
So we will start in 2 minutes about, just allow people to join. So welcome all to this first UNODC Gender Equality Forum organized by the UNODC Gender Team with the support of Ireland. My name is Hannah Sands and I am the program coordinator of the Gender Team. And we are really excited to welcome you to the 3 days of discussions on gender equality and women's empowerment, and kicking off today's discussion with a panel on gender aspects in corruption. Tomorrow, we will focus on law enforcement and access to justice. And on Thursday, we will look at gender aspects in combating organized crime. As many of you know, UNODC operates in fields which are traditionally male dominated, and until recently, they were viewed as more or less gender neutral. Of course, this gives us only half the picture of what really goes on and omits the diversified impact that these have on women and men, boys and girls. To garner a better understanding of the implication of gender equality and women's empowerment in the areas where UNODC work, and to have a better, more systematic approach to gender equality, UNODC adopted its first gender equality strategy in 2018. This strategy is coming to an end this year, and we wanted therefore to take stock of where we are and see how the work of UNODC and the support that we offer to member states has been enriched and strengthened by the inclusion of gender equality and women's empowerment before we embark, of course, on the next edition of the gender strategy. So during these 3 days, we'll be looking at corruption, law enforcement, access to justice, and combating organized crime, as these are fields where UNODC has made marked progress, as well as been able to provide unique support to the member states. Of course, the work is not finished, and we still have a long way to go. So the discussion that we have over the course of the week will also feed into a set of recommendations that we are developing in parallel to the forum. These recommendations will focus on best practices to continue building on, and also the challenges that remain and that we need to focus on in the next 4 years. The recommendations will be launched at a high-level panel in mid-September, where we hope that you can join us. So I'm very excited to welcome so many distinguished experts to help us better understand gender equality and women's empowerment and how that can strengthen the implementation of the 2030 agenda and also our aspirations of leaving no one behind. I look forward to learning from all the panelists today. And finally, I'd like to thank Ireland for their generous support to the Gender Equality Forum. And I would like to thank also Sweden, Australia, as well as Ireland for their unwavering support to gender equality issues in UNODC. Their combined support has made it possible to be where we are today. So thank you very much. So without further ado, I'm very excited to kick off the first panel of the forum that lasts this week. So Magda, I think we show a video now.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Manasseh Chiweshe. I'm talking to you from Harare, Zimbabwe. I'll be the moderator for this panel. We're going to have 5 speakers. Each speaker is going to have 5 minutes to introduce themselves and some of the key issues that I want to discuss about. Then after the discussions and the introductions, we'll go into a question and answer session where I'll be posing questions to the speakers and create a conversation around gender and corruption. So our first speaker will be the Honorable Lady Justice Hedwig Ongudi Mbosa from the High Court of Kenya. She has served as a judicial officer since July 1985. She has also served as the presiding judge of the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Division of the High Court of Kenya from 2016 to 2019. And she's currently serving in the Civil Division of the High Court in Nairobi. Your Honorable, can you please take the floor, introduce yourself, and also outline the key issues that you want to talk to?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. As you've been told, I'm a judge of the High Court of Kenya, and I'm going to look at the laws that govern corruption in Kenya. One of them is the Bribery Act. We have the Public Officers Ethics Act, the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Act, the Proceeds of Crime and Money Laundering Act, and the Leadership and Integrity Act. Then I'll also have a look at the Constitution of Kenya, which provides under Article 27 that there should be no unfair discrimination, and it requires that both genders are provided with equal opportunities at work. I'll also refer to the Judiciary Gender Audit, which carried out an audit on gender issues in the judiciary of Kenya. I will also look at the cases that have been handled in the Anti-Corruption and Economic Crimes Division, especially cases on asset recovery. The cases that I've picked on are cases that are involving women. And the thread that is common in all these cases is that the women have been used as conduits or fronts due to the perception that they are innocent and trustworthy. Men have been charged, but you find that the cases involving the women, there is a man behind them, so that these women are just used as conduits. And when investigations are done, we find that the people that are exposed in cases like this are the wives, the daughters, the mistresses of these men who have been charged. And most institutions in Kenya have in the past been led by men, where we find charges of corruption brought about against them. So the big question is, are women not involved in corruption because they have not been exposed to leadership and have not been empowered, or it's because they are trustworthy and they are innocent? That is the big question. And in Kenya, we also have the two-third gender rule, where a number of our institutions have put it into practice, but the legislation has not yet been set out by our parliament. So I think those are basically the issues that I'm going to discuss. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Honor. You
Yes.
had about 5 minutes, so thank you for quickly just introducing yourself. We'll come back to unpack some of the issues that you have related to, especially the legal and policy framework around gender and corruption, and to see how effective gender is actually mainstreamed within the political and the legal framework within the Kenyan perspective. Our next speaker will be Professor Lena. Please forgive me for if I failed to actually pronounce it very well. Wangarud from the University of Gothenburg. She's a professor in political science, and she has written extensively on issues around corruption, anti-corruption, and also the gendered dimensions of corruption. She is the author of the Principles of Gender-Sensitive Parliaments, and also co-editor of Gender and Corruption, Historical Roots and New Avenues for Research. Prof, you can go ahead, introduce yourself and just speak to your key issues.
Thank you so much for this presentation. So in my short introduction, I will focus on gender differences in attitudes towards social risk and threats, and the implication this has on the effectiveness of anti-corruption policies. Studies from different countries show that women are more anxious or worried than men about social risk and threats. And the major theme in research on the relationship between gender and corruption is that women's risk aversion causes them to refrain from corrupt interactions to a higher degree than men. But the idea of intrinsic gender differences in risk aversion has been critiqued. And the critique built on two different strands of research. First, it needs to be recognized that in high corrupt settings, it can actually be more risky to refrain from corruption than to follow corrupt standard operating procedures. Research shows that the link between gender corruption is stronger in democracies than in authoritarian states, which is an indication that context matters. Women do not always refrain from corruption to a higher degree than men, but they tend to do so in low to medium corrupt countries. Second, research showed that the type of welfare state that people are living in also matters for the attitudes towards corrupt practices. Now I'm referring to research mainly from European countries. In European countries, results show that women are particularly prone to condemn corruption in encompassing welfare states, such as the Scandinavian countries. And this is in comparison to East European countries, but also countries in the European South. The gender gap is not a simple function of the presence or amount of corruption in a country, but is triggered by what women might lose from corruption compared to men. So what do I mean by that? I think that one reason why women in encompassing welfare states condemn corruption to a higher degree is because women are more dependent than men on a well-functioning state in their everyday life. In the more encompassing welfare states, women have experienced how public policy can enable a combination of a paid career and family responsibilities. We know that corruption undermines people's willingness to pay taxes. Corruption is a threat to the root system of a well-functioning state, making the state less able to deliver, for example in the health sector, but also in the sector of education. The content of the state, what it delivers in terms of policies, is closely linked to its capacity. Corrupt states are less capable states, and this is a threat to women in ways different from men. My argument is that risk aversion is a concept that needs to be contextualized. This makes the situation complicated for policymakers. There is no quick fix or one-size-fits-all solution. Instead, there is a need for ongoing oversight from a gender perspective. Policymakers need to ask, in different situations, how corruption may affect the situation for women and men. Broadly speaking, I recommend to differentiate between women citizens, women as civil servants in the bureaucracy, women in political assemblies such as national parliaments, but also local councils, and women in the business sector. Gender interact with informal rules and norms in all these different sectors of society. The question to ask is the same: are there reasons to expect an effect of gender? The answer is, however, likely to vary. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. In sum, gender is important to take into account in analysis of corruption and in policy making. But I warn against any oversimplified understandings of gender. There is not one single gender approach, but a variety of gender approaches to the issue of corruption. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. As we go on with the discussions and as the speakers also introduce themselves, please allow me to the attendees to say that there is a Q&A box, a question and answer box, bottom right of your screen. You can use that to also pose questions as we go along with the discussions and as the panelists also speak some of the issues that they're talking to. So thank you, Prof, for that short introduction around issues around context. Context matters as we'll come back to this later on. The next speaker will be Dr. Ine Kube. She is from the University of Tel Aviv in the School of Political Science, Government and International Relations. She's the co-founder of the Interdisciplinary Corruption Research Network. And also She is the chair of the ECPR Standing Group on Corruption and Integrity. Dr. Kube, please, you can go on.
Okay, thank you so much, Manasseh. You can hear me? Okay. Yeah, as Manasseh introduced me already,
Yes,
my
we can
name is my name is Ina Cooper, and I did my PhD actually on the causes of corruption in Europe. And for several years, I live now in Israel and work at the University of Tel Aviv, and do also now more research related to corruption in the Middle East or the MENA region in general, with a strong focus also on the gender dimension. I try to summarize a bit the research, and I'm sure there are some overlaps with the arguments of Lena already, but we can actually see like two areas. One area that we are focusing on is, on the one hand, if women are really less corrupt than men. So this is like one of the assumptions at the moment that we also see in many policy papers. And on the other hand is of course there is strong argument or the strong finding where we can be very certain about that women are more often the victim of corruption. And we are really glad, or actually it's very important to see that we talk more and more about sextortion, sexual extortion, where not money, so to say, is the currency of the bribe, where sex it is. And I'm currently also working on a project on migration, corruption and human rights violation, where we try to find out where are women exposed to sextortion during their migration path. And the findings are, of course, very sad to see. There are mainly seven areas, so to say, when we try to find out what does it actually mean, how can we characterize the link between corruption and gender. And of course, we see that socialization, of course, plays a role, like how men and women are still socialized in a very different way, which is also related to norms, of course. Then Lena mentioned already that we should have a stronger concentration on risk aversion. And the question is if women are really less risk-oriented than men, or if it's also part of socialization, or maybe it's also part of the fact that women have a different naming and shaming when they act in a corrupt way. As you can see, or we have many examples when corrupt politicians were shamed in a completely different way than men. Another argument is, of course, the opportunities. Women still have less networks, so they also have less opportunities to act actually in a corrupt way, and the future will show if women are really less corrupt than men. Another argument is, of course, gender quotas, and I think it's also important that we discuss this today, because we see that an increase in gender quota, or increase of women and companies on the public sector based on gender quota, also increases gender equality in general. Another point is that we should consider, of course, the role of the woman herself, because we know that people are different as women are. Of course, we're individuals, and there are poor women, there are rich women, educated, less educated, corrupt and less corrupt women. And I think it's very dangerous to see women or gender in general like as a monolith. Of course, we're very diverse, and we should focus more on intersectionality. Another argument is, of course, institutions. Also, Lena mentioned this already, the role of the welfare state, the role of democratic, autocratic system or hybrid regimes themselves. We see, of course, a strong relationship between lower levels of corruption and higher gender equality. And we see higher gender equality, of course, in democracies. And as also already mentioned, is the context. And in my research, I focus more and more on gender norms, so to say, because we see that also based on research that women still think that men are better leaders, that men are still the breadwinners, that they should bring, so to say, the money home, and that many women don't consider themselves as good leaders, or that they are able of specific jobs, for example. So empowerment, of course, also plays a very, very important role. So my main argument is that we should go deeper into these relationships on specific norms, social norms within societies, and also that we not simply focus on the positive influence on women, that we see women, of course, as a very diverse group. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Jennifer Savary-Bradford. She's a program officer in UNODC, joined UNODC in 2013, working in the corruption and economic crime branch. I think the most important part of your work as the publication, The Time Is Now, addressing the gender dimensions of corruption. There's a link to that work. It's important if you can please find time to download that and read through that. It sort of provides an overview of some of the issues that we are discussing today and provides more information around these issues. So over to you, Jennifer, you can go on.
Thank you so much, Manasseh. I hope everybody can hear me clearly, and if not, I will ask you to tell me so. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am really grateful to my colleagues here at UNODC to have invited the Corruption and Economic Crime Branch to be part of this eminent panel. As Manasseh mentioned, I would like to start by taking a few moments to introduce our publication, The Time Is Now, Addressing the Gender Dimensions of Corruption. First of all, I want to start with the point actually where Ina entered somehow, because it's not, this publication is not about women versus men. Are women more corrupt than men or not? Yes, this publication showcases how corruption impacts women and men differently, but it also highlights how this is due to women and men having different access to opportunities to be corrupt. The study focuses on how to address the gender dimensions of corruption, and we have in there an expose of good practices from around the world, and here are a few key messages. First of all, an inclusive society is a less corrupt society. Key to fighting corruption is to unleash the power of diversity and inclusion. Sometimes people get upset with me when I exemplify this by saying we need to break up the networks, often referred to the old boys club. But let me explain. Lack of access to education, coupled with social norms and stereotypes, just like Ina mentioned, have led to women not being given the same access to positions of power, but instead falling behind. And the networks, on the other hand, exist because they are rarely challenged, and they survive by catering to their own. And in fact, gender inequality in power structures is a well-documented subject. Men more frequently have access to decision-making and other positions of power, where acts of corruption may more frequently occur in the form of abuse of power. And this is where the corrupt element, if you wish, comes in, and why we make the important connection between higher levels of gender equality and lower levels of corruption. And that is also why we speak of how gender equality and anti-corruption policies are mutually reinforcing. Lena mentioned this before, lack of data and primary research, on the interplay between gender, accountability, transparency, and power structures. This is a critical point. We heard it already, and I expect we will hear it several times throughout the Gender Equality Forum. Why? Simply put, and here I quote, because those who are invisible in data are also invisible in policies. And here I'm quoting Sylvie Dury, who is the director for the Swiss Federal Office of Gender Equality. After all, one could say that the global gold standard, or what we are all thriving towards, is having evidence as the basis for policymaking. I want to echo Professor Regnerud, I want to echo Ina Kube, local context matters. Contextualization is everything. No two cultures are identical, and at times, even within one domestic setting, we can see differences in a country. And that's why in The Time Is Now, we have 3 case studies that highlight the unique gender narratives of 3 countries, namely Brazil, Ghana, and Indonesia. So in closing, and in line with Article 13 of the UN's Convention Against Corruption, of which, of course, UNODC is the guardian, The participation of society as a whole is critical to fighting corruption. Here we know how different groups, special interest groups, faith-based organizations, women's organizations, can reach different parts of society and engage them and share the knowledge that it is not acceptable, that corruption is just how things are done. No, we need to challenge this. I'm going to end here with a short quote of statistics. I'm not one for numbers, but I thought this one puts it a little bit in perspective. Our panel has a focus very much on public sector, but it's worth pointing out that also the private sector has an important role to play in the fight against corruption. And here I'm citing from the data from S&P Composite 1500 Index of 2015, that there are more CEOs of large US companies who are named David at 4.5% than there are CEOs who are women at 4.1%. And actually, David isn't even the most common first name among CEOs. That's John at 5.3%. So having ended on that, Manasseh, I hand back the floor to you and stand ready for an engaging discussion.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Thank you for that. I think we have some interesting issues that are coming from you, which we'll try to unpack later on. What I got mainly is that those who are not in data are not in policy, and that's important for us as we unpack these discussions. How do we begin to ensure that we have data, we have information, we have all these measures that are also gendered, and looking at the various also other identities like age, race, ethnicity, disability. How do we begin to actually understand all these issues? So I'll move on to the next speaker. Our next speaker is Alexandra Abashon. She is the Manager Prevention, Risk and Knowledge in the Integrity Vice Presidency at the World Bank. She is a specialist in governance, and she has also led in the development of the Global Procurement Anti-Corruption and Transparency Platform. Alexandra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Manasseh, and thank you to the organisers for the invitation. I'm really delighted to be here and to be part of this panel on an important and timely subject. I think I'm going to echo a lot of the things that Jennifer said. The Time Is Now publication provides a really useful roadmap, I think, for the work that needs to be done. There is still a lot we don't know about the gender dimensions of corruption. We do know, however, that globally, women make up the majority of informal sector workers. And we know that informal businesses typically pay more bribes to the police or to corrupt networks in order to stay in business. We know that women are more vulnerable to rent seeking when accessing health and education services for themselves or their children. We know that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated existing gender gaps in labor markets and access to economic opportunity. So this week's forum is particularly vital and timely. And the recent report that Jennifer led, The Time Is Now, addressing the gender dimensions of corruption, addresses the economic imperative of women's empowerment. It also makes the case, and I think this is really important, that reducing gender inequality itself reduces corruption. So reducing gender inequality and addressing the gender dimensions of corruption are mutually reinforcing, and both are development imperatives. This matters to those of us who work on women's empowerment, on governance and anti-corruption, and on law enforcement and anti-corruption. I'll briefly focus my remarks on three dimensions of the challenge that I think are important and where the international development community and governments need to make more progress. How we measure corruption, how we define and sanction corrupt practices, and the importance of corruption reporting channels. So first on corruption measurement. There's a new emphasis internationally and a lot of momentum by governments as well to improve our ability to measure corruption. And this is important so we can track our progress in controlling it. We also need to do more work to measure and assess the impacts of corruption. And here, there is a lot less evidence to go on. By impacts of corruption, I mean, what are the costs? What is the harm? Who is affected? This is important because identifying the kinds of corruption that affect women more than men and why can help us make the economic case for gender-focused anti-corruption reform and help in designing the reforms to address the problem. So we need more gender disaggregated data on corruption and a better diagnosis of how it impacts women differently than men. As we've heard from the other panelists, though, some things can't be measured if they don't exist in data, but also if they don't have a name and a definition. And this is a problem with sextortion, which Ina mentioned just now, sexual corruption, as it's sometimes called, where the sexual act is the currency of a bribe in exchange for access to a right or a public service, a job, a university program, an educational qualification, a business license, or having the water or the power turned on. The lack of a definition, legal definition for sextortion is not a conceptual problem, it's an access to justice challenge. So you can't measure and you can't redress and you can't prosecute what you don't have a legal definition for. And this is the second topic I want to touch on, how we define and sanction corrupt practices. And particularly focus on sextortion as a subset of the kinds of corruption that affect women particularly. Sextortion has gone unaddressed in part because of the similarity it bears to sexual exploitation and sexual abuse. These also suffer from underreporting and underenforcement. If a behavior is unsurprising or even ubiquitous, why report it? If authorities don't enforce sanctions for particular behaviors, it's natural to wonder whether it is worth reporting an offense and whether something that is endemic can truly be unlawful. There are laws that criminalize sexual abuse or exploitation. These don't help in the context of sextortion because they rely on the absence of consent for a prosecution. The nature of corruption of a rent-seeking transaction, as is the case with sextortion, is that there is a power imbalance in which the victim feels they don't have a choice. So existing sexual abuse legislation doesn't help. There is a gap in our regulations. There's also a conceptual gap in the legal definitions that underpin anti-corruption laws, in the sense that a corrupt transaction is understood to involve the exchange of a thing of value, a bribe. And typically we think of a bribe as a financial transaction, the exchange of a good, an asset, a benefit in kind in return for a service or right. This should not, on the face of it, exclude sextortion. And yet crossing that conceptual gap appears more difficult than it should be. Access to a woman's body is a thing of value, not to mention the theft of her dignity and sense of safety. Anti-corruption laws should be able to help here. To measure the preponderance of a crime and to enforce anti-corruption laws, crimes need to be reported. This brings me to the third topic I wanted to mention, the importance of corruption reporting channels. There are some practical steps that can and need to be taken by governments in particular to make people aware of their rights. People need to know that the behavior they have witnessed or encountered or experienced is unlawful, in this case, a form of corruption, for them to come forward and report it. Corruption reporting mechanisms also need to play a role in building confidence that encourages people to come forward. In other words, they need to reassure people that the information reported will be treated confidentially or anonymously if that option is available, with no repercussions for the reporting person, and that the information will be acted on. This last point is vital and depends on the credibility not only of the authorities responsible for handling complaints, but of the broader rule of law systems for enforcing sanctions. As we've heard from the other panelists, context matters. Suitable reporting channels will be different in different contexts, whether these need to be in person, online, by phone, and so on. We also need to know more about what can usefully prompt women to report corruption of all kinds, so as to create those enabling conditions. Perception surveys could ask women whether they've reported corruption and under what circumstances. And whistleblower mechanisms and corruption reporting mechanisms also need to collect gender disaggregated data. So I've focused on three dimensions of the question: how we measure corruption, how we define and sanction corrupt practices, and the importance of corruption reporting channels. The topics mentioned by the other panelists are equally important and interesting, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Very much, Dr. Abashon. I think in terms of the conversation now, I'd like to begin from where you've touched on the last aspects of the legal definitions, the legal issues and the challenges in terms of if you can't name it, if you can't actually call it out, how do you then police it and how do you then have laws around it? So I would like to invite the Honorable Ongudi to speak to the Kenyan context and also speak to some of the experiences in terms of how then is the Kenyan experience in terms of gender mainstreaming or mainstreaming women's issues within the anti-corruption laws. How is the experience within that context? How successful is Kenya has been in doing that, and what are the challenges that they've faced in terms of actually ensuring that the corruption that affects women more is actually accurately and properly contextualized within the laws themselves, or the laws have remained gender blind and the one size fits all, as has been talked about by some of the panelists. Honorable.
Thank you, Mr. Manasseh. As I indicated earlier, we have legislation that deals with corruption issues. And I've heard from my colleagues on the issue of sex being used as a currency. The offenses connected with this are not in this in the legislation dealing with corruption, but we have the Sexual Offences Act, and which gives guidelines on the reporting structures of this kind of harassment, whether it's at your place of work or somewhere else, the offices that you may go to go and report a matter, because we have had instances where a lady who has been offended has gone to the police station to report that incident, and they end up being sexually molested because they are complaining maybe about corruption of a man, and then the male officers there do that to them. So we have policies in place, and even at our place of work, like in the judiciary, we have a policy dealing with sexual harassment of the staff or of colleagues amongst us. So you find that at times, because an officer or a staff fears the repercussions of what may happen to them, because the person they would want to complain about is a senior officer, they keep it to themselves. But we have had instances where reports are made. And okay, maybe we would say the people in the villages who may not have access to some of these policies may not know exactly where to go or what to do. But some of us have been actively involved. We even visit, we go to churches, we go to schools and explain to them what these legislations are all about and what they need to do in the event that they come across anything like that. It may not be 100%, it may not even be 70%, but we have tried. Just sharing out and educating the people on what they need to do in the event that they come across anything like that. And then the cases I was talking about, where women have been used as conduits. The women who have done that are not the illiterate women. It is the literate women who have gone to school, they are in good positions. They are the ones who have been found to be used as conduits in corruption matters. So that is the experience that we have, but policies are there, though they may not be sufficient, but we are on that path. And we have not done an audit on, just like Ghana, Indonesia, and Brazil have done. As a nation, we have not done that kind of audit. So I may not speak from a point of knowledge that this is the fact. that we have gone. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Maybe Prof. Lena, you can come in there in terms of some of the issues that the Honorable was speaking to, especially around data and statistics. How then do we begin to measure issues that concern women, men, girls, and boys when it comes to corruption? How do we begin to ensure that the reporting mechanisms are actually gender inclusive, as it were?
Okay, the various institutions have been given that mandate and that assignment to deal to have the data and put down the number of cases that have come their way and the issues that have come their way. But then, you know, most of these institutions, I'm sorry to say that, but most of these institutions are led by men. They are headed by men. So that you find that even getting that data may not be as easy as we may talk about it. So you find that that data is not there unless there is a woman that is in a leadership position and personally follows it. Like we have the Women Judges Association, which tries to follow up some of these issues and gets some data, but it's never made public.
All right. Thank you very much. Professor Lena Wengrud, maybe you want to come in and help us. How do we then ensure that we have reporting mechanisms that are gender inclusive?
Yeah. Well, first, I would like to comment on what was discussed in before here, and okay. I'm not saying that legislation does not matter at all, but if laws and legislation was the only thing that mattered, then there would be no corruption today, because most countries and most settings have anti-corruption legislations and laws. So of course, this is important in order to raise awareness, but we also need to look more at the informal structure and the collective actions in different settings. So here is the key, I think, to start to make changes to go beyond legislations and laws. And when it comes to collecting good data, I think it's very important to have a very broad approach, because we do not really know where gender matters. And if you only collect data, for example, regarding women in the bureaucracy, then perhaps you will find that there is no gender differences, because research shows that gender matters less among the administrative staff, among the bureaucracy, than among elected politicians. So if you don't have a broad approach, you may miss the context where gender actually has an effect. And in most countries, we can see that the relationship between gender and corruption is stronger if we focus on elected politicians, like politicians in national parliaments, in local councils, etc. And why is this the case? Because in most countries, female politicians are expected to push more for public service delivery than men. And we can also see at the subnational level in, for example, European countries, that the number of women varies in local councils. And where the number of women is high, the level of corruption is lower, especially among female politicians and female citizens, and especially in the areas of education and health services. But we don't really know why this is happening. We think there is something about the connection between female politicians and female voters, that female politicians can refer back to women as voters and saying, there's a push for us, we need to deliver. And then perhaps, we don't know what's happening, they are able to convince their male colleagues that, yes, this is important because women voters also have power at election day. So therefore, we also need to listen to them. But going back to your question, this question on what kind of data to collect and how to do this, I think especially at the start, we need to have a very, very broad approach. Otherwise, we risk missing where gender matters. And this is a very, how to say, expensive answer, because it's expensive to collect this kind of data, but I can see no other solution. When we collect data, try to take a gender perspective into account, even though we do not know beforehand the gender actually will matter in this area. So that would be my answer.
All right, thank you very much. I'll move to Dr. Ina Kobe. Maybe building on this discussion around data, gender inclusive reporting mechanisms, maybe you can also come in and help us in terms of looking at some of the effective gender specific policies that can be instituted or implemented to fight corruption or as an anti-corruption mechanisms within the broader context of women and gender. I know it's a big question, but if you can just break up from your own experiences, what then, given the context that we are speaking of, where there's a lack of data, where we have policies that are not necessarily context specific, how then, what are some of the effective gender specific policies that you can speak to?
Okay, so on the one hand, I mean, we're working with the definition of corruption as the misuse of entrusted power for private gain for many, many years. And now we're realizing, oh, actually it didn't work because we didn't actually define corruption in the correct way. And based on our definitions, we also create measurements, also didn't work. And then we're wondering, okay, we still have a lot of corruption around the world. So now is the research at this point where we are saying, okay, maybe we have to reconsider the definition again. Maybe we could use a different definition of corruption. And I agree with Lena, who's saying, okay, we need a very broad approach. Otherwise, we're missing the details maybe, or maybe we overlook, so to say, areas that are also important. But I think it might also be helpful, of course, at first to reconsider and redefine corruption. And on the other hand, also to concentrate on specific forms, that we're not saying, okay, we have a look at corruption, so that we have a specific look at, are we talking about bribery here, about embezzlement, about favoritism, which is already very, very difficult to define, also to measure? Are we talking about sextortion? And we should not forget that, I mean, in the end, it's a very sensitive issue to talk about corruption. I mean, who is admitting that the person acted in a corrupt way? So we are mainly working with perceptions, and we should not forget this. We are only working with data of perception, how other people perceive that. And when we then talk about sextortion, which is like concluding or like combining, so to say, corruption with sex, which is a very, very, very sensitive topic, and then we try to find data. I think the only option I see at the moment is, of course, to do interviews, but of course with a very, like, I mean, it raises many ethical issues, of course, to have interviews in this area, but I don't think there is any other chance. And I think it's also important. I mean, we say we are mainly focusing on the public sector, but of course we also need higher gender equality in the private sector, because all the like leading companies in the world are still run by, maybe some exceptions, by men. So we also need more role models. I also see this in when I'm teaching. I teach gender equality. I teach about corruption at several institutions at the university in Tel Aviv. And it's so important that also students see that there is a woman, and that the woman can also have a career, and that the woman can talk about specific things. And of course, Lena said female politicians feel connected to female voters, and the other way around, or female voters have power. And of course, also women or young, like girls or young women, feel more comfortable to talk women if the woman is a teacher, or talk about specific things that are very sensitive. So in general, we should bring more women, of course, into public positions, but also in the private sector, definitely.
All right, maybe I let you go. I'll just want to go to the Q&A. There's a question there that you might want to to speak to. The question is, from your intervention then, can one make a conclusion that if women are more empowered, to be in positions of authority, they'll also be less corrupt or more corrupt? Is there a link then in terms of increasing women's participation or women's presence within positions of authority and corruption or anti-corruption? Yes, to you, Doctor.
I know that it's a very important question, and that, of course, many politicians are interested in this, and public institutions and the private sector. But I always think, like, why is it important? If women are less corrupt or more honest or less honest or more ethical, whatever. I mean, in the end, it's about gender equality and it's about inclusion, it's about diversity. And as you said, like, women are half of the population, so why still do they have to justify if they are, okay, just bring us in because we are less corrupt, and then we just steer it a bit and we improve the situation. We still don't know if women are more or less corrupt. But I know this is also one of the main arguments, or that many people think if you give more power to women, men lose some of their power or some of their rights. But this is definitely not the case. It's about, as I said, diversity and equality and inclusion. But we are, of course, research on this, if women are less corrupt than men, but I don't believe so.
All right, thank you. Building on that, Dr. Alexandra Abashon, maybe you can come back to the issue that I was beginning to speak about when you're looking at some of the policies that can be implemented to actually promote gender equality within the anti-corruption space. Maybe you can also bring in the issue of COVID-19 and the problems that COVID-19 also sort of brought into the fore when it comes to anti-corruption measures. What can you say in terms of some of the ways that we can actually say that we are building a gender-sensitive or gender-responsive anti-corruption system or process?
Thank you, Manasseh. I think, you know, to echo the other panelists, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done. I did want to pick up the thread of Ina's last remarks and this question about whether women are less corrupt than men. And I'll echo something that was drawn out in the UNODC report, The Time Is Now, that really I think what we need to focus on is disrupting existing networks of patronage and clientelism. And it just so happens that women are excluded from those networks for reasons that are, you know, historical. And any sort of disruption to a clientelistic network is helpful. And empowering women can have that effect. So I definitely agree with what's been said then. I also wanted to pick up a point that Lena made about the fact that, you know, laws are important, but so far ineffective, really, in eliminating corruption. And I think she's absolutely right. I think there's a nuance to be made here in regards to the gender dimensions of corruption, that where anti-corruption laws exist and they're not enforced, there's a general perception of impunity, which can make the public feel very cynical. Where corruption against women is not reflected or addressed in regulations, it's not so much a situation of impunity, but one of indifference. And I think there's an important message that needs to be sent by policymakers, by governments, to help destigmatize, and this is something that Ina mentioned, right? That this is particularly sexual corruption, sextortion, as she said, is a very sensitive subject. Reporting that you've been you've been the victim of this kind of corruption is incredibly stigmatized. Public messages about awareness of rights and behaviors that are not acceptable can hopefully help as a deterrent. And I think that governments could do a lot more on public messaging about what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. We've also seen in some countries anecdotal evidence that public campaigns against bribery in service delivery, rent seeking in service delivery can be quite impactful. Sort of crowdsourcing experiences of, you know, inappropriate behavior and even the I paid a bribe movements and what have you. So if messaging from policymakers, systems for crowdsourcing, anonymous crowdsourcing of reports and complaints, to have that deterrent effect, I think would be important in changing the tide. The impact of the pandemic on women's participation in labor markets and access to economic opportunities, and I think is only likely to exacerbate this sort of gender divide in corruption, in making women more vulnerable to rent-seeking opportunities as they are less economically empowered. I think the response to that has to be a redoubling of our efforts, of which this panel is an example, and really to push policymakers on messaging and on the anti-corruption regulations. So on all fronts, on the anti-corruption enforcement front as well.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer Bradford. Jennifer, I would like to go back to your report. The time is now, specifically the 3 case studies that you spoke to. Maybe you can build on some of these questions that we are having and the conversations we have around the nature, impact of corruption within those 3 case studies when it comes to women and men. What are the differences between men and women when it comes to the nature and impacts of corruption? But also speak to the notions of the grassroots organizations and actors that are involved in anti-corruption within these 3 case studies. Who are we missing? Who is working within those spaces? Are they fairly captured in terms of understanding the work that they are doing and also going forward? Jennifer?
Thank you, Manasseh. Yeah, I mean, I really want to pick up on a little bit of what everybody has said, because there have been so many important points here. And I think one of the points you made, Manasseh, this is the fact that knowing your rights means that you know when they've been violated. This is an incredibly important point. And what we saw, for instance, in the case study in Ghana was that there was a huge outreach done through the Ghana Integrity Initiative to grassroots level, to women who had recently become widows, and they did not know what their rights were for and entitlements when it came to inheritance laws. And now through this project, there was outreach and they were informed and they could claim their rights. I mean, that's a very, very important starting point. I also want to tap in a little bit to the COVID-19 pandemic. You know, this is highlighted and brought to the fore already existing weaknesses. And at times it really has exacerbated them across the world. And, you know, we mustn't deny that women have a critical relationship with the health sector due to their reproductive health needs. And there are relatively few studies that have been carried out on corruption risks in the health sector. But one of them, also again, as it happens from Ghana, points out how for many women, it is critical to know how their complaint will be treated if they do come forward and report corruption. Yeah? Do they have faith that they're in the system and that their complaint will be kept confidential, or will they be retaliated against? So I think, you know, this leads us into something else that was discussed earlier, which is the whole idea of the reporting systems that are in place. If people, first of all, don't know what is wrong, they won't report it. Second of all, if there are no systems in place to report them, or even if there are, but people don't know where to go, cases will not be reported. And finally, if people do not have faith in this reporting system, they will also not come forward. And this is why we speak a lot in The Time Is Now about these gender-sensitive reporting mechanisms. And we actually have a lot to learn from the gender-based violence reporting mechanisms that exist and so on. I also want to come back a little bit and say, when it comes to the UN's Convention Against Corruption, the basic element there is an undue advantage. And an undue advantage should be interpreted as widely as possible. And that will also include sexual favors. Nobody can come and say that, well, you know, whatever I got this woman or that man to do, or whatever we did was part of my salary. No. In public and private sector, that is an undue advantage. You can call it sextortion. We prefer not to. We refer to it as sexual corruption. But at the end of the day, it is an undue advantage, and it is very well covered by the convention, with, you know, very many countries around the world almost nearing universal adherence. We can actually do this. There are ways, but it comes down to the interpretation of the law. And this is where I really, really appreciated having a judge on the panel. Justice Ngudi, thank you so much, because at the end of the day, it is the interpretation that matters. What meaning do we give the words? Because as I don't know if it was Alex or if it was Lena who said, if we were just up to legislation, we'd have no more corruption. This is very true, very, very true. But we need to look at the impact of this legislation and its interpretation. And here I will end by what I always say, which is that we need to realize that we are all biased. We are all biased. We are, you know, affected and influenced by the surroundings in which we grow up, which is why this whole contextualization is so important. What matters is, do we realize that we are biased? Because once we have that realization, we can start addressing it. Thank you, Manasseh. Oh, back to you.
Thank you. Maybe to build on that, the Honorable Judge might want to come in and speak to some of the issues that you're talking about in terms of actually ensuring implementation of laws and some of the challenges that come with actually trying to ensure that they speak to some of these issues that we speak to, like sextortion and things like that. Honorable. Maybe also, Honorable, you can speak to the COVID-19 context within Kenya and the judiciary and access to that for women when it comes to anti-corruption.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Manasseh. I agree with what has been stated, especially women not knowing their rights, or even just both men and women not knowing their rights. They may not know what to complain about. And as a judiciary, you know, we sit and wait for a matter to be brought before the court. We cannot go out there and look for matters to bring to the court for us to make a determination. But once this matter has been brought to court, then we now have the opportunity to make an interpretation and make a decision on it. So we are always available. Because the moment you now go out there, you are going out of your environment as a judicial officer, and you'll be accused of doing something that is outside your profession. So we wait for these matters to be brought to the court. And on the COVID-19, we have had a number of issues where there have been accusations and counter-accusations about the way the money that has been released for this purpose has been handled. And we as the court will wait to receive either somebody charged or a complaint against someone. Then now we delve into the evidence that is available. But I can assure you that we have had those complaints. And then, of course, people will say, we wish we had some ladies who are in a good position, in the people who are doing the procurement and even receiving it, because ladies would be more careful and ensure that whatever is brought is actually utilized for the purpose for which either the funds or even the medication had been released and brought into the country. So it also comes to the issue of procurement. we have also had those issues with the institutions that have been assigned or given the mandate to deal with these issues of corruption, issues of non-accountability. So we still wait. As the judiciary, we still wait for them to be brought to the court. But what I would say is that for the women who are knowledgeable, I think from wherever you are, whether you are in a point of leadership or not, there's something you can do in terms of cutting short these corrupt deals and so on. We don't need to wait to be in positions of power or leadership for us to act. Wherever we are, we can still do something. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. My next question would be to Dr. Lina Wangnarud. Prof. Lina, maybe if you can now begin to speak to some of the issues of how we can respond to some of these challenges. We have talked about the challenge of a lack of evidence or data. We have talked about laws that are on the books that are not effective in terms of actually being implemented and enforced. We've talked about also the challenges that COVID-19 is also posing in terms of anti-corruption and some of the issues that affect women. We've talked about the legal issues around naming and actually having a proper issues framed around issues like sextortion. What then can be done, in your view, to actually have a system or efforts that respond to women's concerns when it comes to corruption? Professor Wangarud.
Thank you so much. If I could give you a short answer to these questions, I would win the Nobel Prize, I guess, because they are very important questions, but also very hard to answer in a simple way. But if I start with the issue of COVID-19, because it's so timely, but also very important. One thing that we know from research is that there is a gender difference in different forms of corruption. I think that Ina was discussing this, that we need to disentangle different forms of corruption. And together with colleagues at my department in Gothenburg, we started to make a distinction between need and greed corruption. And need corruption is something that citizens tend to do in order to get things that they are entitled to. Greed corruption is something that citizens or other people use in order to get hold on favors that they are not entitled to. And we have also seen in different kinds of surveys and also using other kinds of measurements that women use need corruption more than men, but men are more into greed corruption. And when it comes to COVID-19, I'm actually a bit worried that women will start to be more corrupt than they have been before, because they are in a situation where they are expected to care for the kids and family and also relatives. And if they don't get the kind of medicines or whatever they need in order to take care of their families, well, then they will use need corruption. So in this situation, perhaps previous gender gaps showing that women are less corrupt than men will actually diminish, and women will use corruption more than before. And this is, I think that this points to a very important fact, and this is that we should not only collect data on how corrupt people are in different situations, but also try to get at this more difficult issue. Why do people, citizens in different contexts, use corruption? Is it because they need it in order to get things that they should have or that they are entitled to, but in order to get hold on things, they need to use corruption? Or is it out of greed because they want to have favors that they are not entitled to? So this is very important. And where to start, what kind of policies to use? I disaggregated data where you collect data for men and women in all kinds of situations where we collect data. I think that this is where we should start. So where we collect data today, try to disaggregate it as much as possible, because we cannot decide beforehand where gender matters the most. This is something that I'm sorry, but we need to have this broad approach. But if I have to pick just one area where I think that we lack data, is something that was missing before, and this is the non-delivery of public goods. So what is the effect of corruption? Well, in most situations it is that citizens do not get what they are entitled to in forms of public goods. And this is so hard to measure, because then we try to measure something that is not there. But I'm not a policymaker, but this is there where I should start to work. So, and also start to get people noticing the negative effects of corruption, because this is money lost, money that could be used for good things, and especially for women, like better health care, better welfare, better education for kids in schools. And yeah, this is my very perhaps too complex answer, but sorry, I cannot help, but the questions are so broad and so important.
All right. Thank you very much. Maybe Dr. Inekobik, if you want to continue on that thread, and maybe also answer that question that I've posed, but also maybe speak to issues around other identity markers that reflect on women, because women are not a homogeneous group, as we know. We have got issues that have to relate to women with disabilities, young women, race, ethnicity. How do all these other issues come into play when we're discussing anti-corruption responses within the context of gender and corruption?
I also want to say something or I agree, of course, again with Lena, because I'm very familiar with the research of Lena. But I think if we really want to find more solutions, and as we said, there's not one solution, it should be a combined approach, an overall approach. And I think we should start with working on these myths and not trying to find out anymore if women are more corrupt or less corrupt compared to men, and so that we don't do this oversimplification anymore. I think it's also very important what Elena said about need and greed corruption, that we have a stronger focus on the need corruption, like why people really have to bribe. I mean, in most of the cases, they really need it, to survive it, to get food, to get access to health, to get a shelter. But we are also working on the greed dimension. So I researched together with a colleague from Spain on the impact of hormones on the level of testosterone, how this is also affecting our corrupt behavior or greedy behavior in some situations. I also believe that it's very important to have a stronger look at the relationship between corruption, or to see corruption actually as a human rights violation. Because in this moment when people do not have access to education, to health, which is of course a human right, it's basically a human rights violation if politicians or public officials use the money for their own benefit instead of giving it to the public. Then of course I agree that we need disaggregated data, but as I said, there are many ethical issues, and it's a very sensitive topic. And I also can say that, I mean, gender equality, it starts at home, and also how kids are educated by their parents and how they are raised with which values. And of course, at home in the household, equality should start. Like, who takes care of the dishes? Who takes care of the cooking? Who takes care of the clothes, so to say? And I think it starts already at this micro level to bring it up then to the top level.
Right, thank you. Maybe the same question to Dr. Alexandra Abashon around where do we go from here now in terms of policies and policy making around anti-corruption, but also understanding that women are found in different places and spaces. Yes.
Thank you, Manasseh. So where do we go? I mean, obviously there's been a lot of emphasis on data gathering. I do want to mention that the World Bank Group's gender strategy it emphasizes data collection. This was launched in 2015, and it involves gender tagging World Bank projects to embed a gendered perspective into project design and analysis, and generating measurable results based on data and evidence of what works, and disaggregating those results by gender. There is the World Bank Group's gender data portal publishes all of the sex disaggregated data and gender statistics generated by bank projects for those who are interested. And I think even though there isn't an overt focus on corruption, this is a very broad-based data resource. I think those of us who focus on anti-corruption would do well to partner with those who work on human capital development, on social development, because as we know, these are the areas, these are the sectors in which women are more vulnerable to the kinds of corruption. I very much like the distinction between need and greed corruption. I think it's a very helpful distinction. And in that, so that's on the data side of things. On the anti-corruption front, those who specialize on anti-corruption, it actually seems to me that a lot of anti-corruption policies can be effective in addressing the heightened vulnerability of women to corruption. Certainly in public service delivery, this is the sort of the need side of corruption, and strategies that are increasingly relying on technology to remove discretion and opportunity at the point at which citizens interact with public service providers. These are agnostic in a sense in terms of gender, except insofar as women may have less access to the technologies, but they are still powerful instruments in removing that level of discretion to which women are more vulnerable. It is important in the anti-corruption sphere to differentiate between the types of corruption and the appropriate responses to them. So if we're looking at corruption in service delivery, this sort of need-based arena for corruption, as opposed to grand corruption, patronage, clientelism, then we're looking at a very, very different set of interventions. And here it's not sort of discrete strategies to remove discretion and opportunity. It's much more about disrupting networks, and that will require a whole range of different policies, and including supporting women's access to roles of leadership and political representation. I think crucially, as other panelists have said. I'll stop there. Thank you. Back to you, Manasseh.
Thank you very much. Jennifer, if I can come to you. Jennifer, you can respond to some of the issues that are coming from the other panelists, but I would want you to also focus in on the grassroots organizations. What is there a role for grassroots organizations in this discussion around anti-corruption and gender, building on your experience in the three cases that you spoke to, but also going forward? What role can grassroots organizations play within this broad field?
Thank you, Manasseh. I think that grassroots organizations have a hugely important role to play. Once again, if you do not know that you do not know what your rights are, you will not know when they are violated. This incredibly important role of awareness raising frequently ends up lying with this type of organization. They have ways of reaching parts of the population that television and radio will never manage. And especially when we come to a digital divide and so on, I think reaching the as far as possible out into rural settings and so on I think here there's no comparison to what grassroots organizations can do and the role that they can play in the fight against corruption. I'd like to pick up something that Alexandra was just mentioning, and this is again speaking about the digitalization. So one of the policies that we've really been looking closely at in UNODC is public procurement. Now, I know to many who are not into anti-corruption and so on, this sounds like a dry topic, but gosh, there is potential here. So one of the issues that we've seen is, and good practices that are reflected in the Times now, is how one can use various forms of gender equality requirements when carrying out public procurement. Here, for instance, we have in Switzerland where no company can sign a contract with the state without having a gender equality policy in place. We have, for instance, in Kenya, actually, where I think it's 30% of public procurement contracts have been reserved for businesses owned by women, youth, and disabled. This has been something that's been replicated also in South Africa. They've raised it as far as 40%. Now, in the case of Kenya, what came up was that, well, these vulnerable groups or underrepresented groups, shall we say, in the public procurement sector, then had to confront the public procurement officers, who then started harassing them and asked for bribes. And my understanding is that one of the ways of addressing this is precisely what Alexandra said. Put it online, minimize the contact between the public official and whoever it is as a civilian that you are interacting with, in order to avoid this opportunity to ask for bribes or initiate some form of corruption. Yeah. So I wanted to really highlight that, because it's a very practical way in which governments can step forward. Tagging on to the sort of social context and so on, I want to highlight there the case study from Indonesia, where the Anti-Corruption Commission created a special, now it has become an association and it's all right, but it became a movement called I Am a Woman Against Corruption, because they did a survey and it showed that only 4% of parents taught honesty to their children. And therefore they felt that we need to engage women more in the fight against corruption, so that also they can share it in their own circles, be it with children or with each other. And I think today they have, this association stands at well over 2,500 agents who have been identified as having contributed in the fight against corruption and preventing corruption in their own work environment. And this has become a network. And as I said, today it's an association in its own right. But it builds a lot on what one may call the traditional games, the traditional behaviors of the society. And again, this is why contextualization matters. Thank you, Manasseh. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Maybe I will go to Dr. Inakube, maybe to build on that. Within your research network, the Interdisciplinary Corruption Research Network, what are some of the non-traditional actors, building on the question of the grassroots and grassroots efforts to actually respond to agenda and corruption? What are some of the traditional and non-traditional actors that we can really begin to speak to in terms of responding to some of these questions that we have posed?
It's interesting that you refer to ICN as a grassroots organization, but actually it is, yes. So the history of this network was that we were PhD students working on corruption. Actually, it started in Germany, and we didn't have anyone to talk with, because there was not so much corruption. It was like several years ago, and we were 6 people, and then we founded this network, and then it was just like growing and growing and growing. Like we had another colleague from Paris, Sophia Wickberg, and people from Romania, UK, from the US, and now there are like, I think, 3,000 people. So it's a Facebook group actually, and we're exchanging their literature, like job positions related to anti-corruption, gender equality, everything related actually to illegal behavior, so to say. Workshops, conferences, and people share also their knowledge like from their own countries. So it's actually about education and raising awareness. We're organizing once a year a conference. We just had it last week where we discuss measurements, definitions, anti-corruption strategies. So I think this is like, one way to include not only academics, but also professionals, practitioners that are working in the field. Because I mean, we have, so to say, the theories, the researchers, but of course we need the data from the field. So it's also about bridging, of course, the gap between academia and professionals and people working on the ground, so to say. But we see, I mean, it's always very difficult to measure impact, but I think we see there like at least an increase of awareness towards corruption.
Thank you very much. Honorable Ongudi, you were speaking to issues that were relating to the fact that where you meet a woman, data is kept or is available, but where you meet a man within the system, there's no data there. But in your own experience, in your own expertise, how do we begin to bring men into this discussion? How do we begin to actually have men become part of the conversation and part of the process of actually fighting the gender dimensions of corruption?
Thank you,
Honorable.
Mr. Manasseh. Thank you, Mr. Manasseh. No, we are not saying that it's only women who are involved in this discussion. We also have men who are involved in it. But you find that a number of the people who are led into giving bribes or being involved in corruption are people from, okay, I'm talking about Kenya, people who are not educated, they don't know their rights. Because you see, if someone approaches a service provider for something that they need to be given, and then the service provider says, if you do not do 1, 2, 3, you will not get this. If it is somebody who knows that it is their right to have that, they will not give a bribe. They will not involve themselves in anything corruptible. They will first of all go and report the matter. So I think what we need, as some of our colleagues here have indicated, is awareness. We should get inside there and actually explain to these members of society about their rights, what they are actually entitled to, either from government or service providers. Because if they are not enlightened on that, you know, it's like, from what I have seen, it's like they have taken it just like part of life. When they pay a bribe, when they give the bribe, they are okay with it. They don't see anything wrong with it. And it's because they have not been enlightened. So when we have a meeting like this, the one we are having right now, if we even bring other men, some men on board, it will still work. Any other meeting that we have, we involve both gender so that they can also feel, they can also know that as women, we feel they are too much in this vice of corruption, so that they know that even if they are doing it, we as women know what they are doing, and we are not going to give them that kind of support. We are going to fight it together. And
Okay,
and also, just a minute. Also, when they are brought to the courts and they are found guilty, we give stiff penalties for that. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I think I'll now move to some of the questions that were coming from the participants and people who are attending the workshop. the first question, I don't know how I'm going to do this, but I think if any one of you wants to answer, they can come in and answer some of these questions. The first question is, how can countries in the UN improve evidence-based policymaking in the absence of quality anti-corruption data, particularly sex disaggregated data or safe corruption reporting channels or mechanisms? I would want to take that up. How can countries in the UN improve evidence-based policymaking in the absence of quality anti-corruption data and also in the absence of sex disaggregated data?
If I can start to answer, I think that there are quite a lot of surveys already done in many countries that can be used more to base policies on. I mean, we do not have enough of data, but there are a lot of surveys, etc., done in. It does not cover all countries, but I think there is data to start with. So it's not that we don't have any data at all, but it can, of course, be more.
Thank you. If I may, Manasseh?
Yes.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to what Lena was saying. You know, the UN's Convention Against Corruption has an implementation review mechanism, and one of the most common recommendations there is improve your statistics, improve your data across the globe. Yeah? Developed country across all the states parties to the convention. So we know that data, in particular corruption data, is lacking. Gendered corruption data is even more. Yeah. But I think an important point to make is that we don't only need the quantitative data. We also need the qualitative data. And here, I'd like to wish, and this is something that's already been put in the chat, UNODC carried out anti-corruption surveys in Nigeria, and we reused this data, added on more data, and did a gendered analysis. And I believe that the report is floating in the chat already. But what's really important there is that with this qualitative data, you get this contextualization. And even if it is perception-based, I will say this: there is the reality, there is the perception, and then there is the reality of the perception. So the reality may be that you have fantastic anti-corruption laws. The perception is that you have an extremely corrupt government. And the reality of the perception is that nobody has faith in this government, even if it's doing all the right things. And I think this is where, the policymakers really have a role to play in reaching out and explaining what they're doing. And we were talking about grassroots organizations, but I think also, the state institutions themselves need to highlight what they are doing and in order to build back the trust in the institutions. Thank you. Next.
I'll jump in, Manasseh, if I may, and possibly a slightly controversial position, which is, well, the question already includes its own answer, right? In the absence of evidence base, how do we make policies? I don't think we wait for the evidence base. I think we develop the evidence base and we also make common sense policies in the meantime. And there's a reason why this forum is combining the concepts of gender equality and crime and criminal justice and corruption, right? There are already a lot of things that we know about the role of addressing gender inequality to improve development outcomes. And we know that certain sectors are more vulnerable to corruption and that women are more active in seeking services in certain sectors. There are certain things that are intuitive, and there are certain things that are common sense. And I think position statements by governments and one by the UN will be really, really important in setting a course in the right direction and helping to propel the collection of additional data and evidence. I'll stop there for now. I did have another point to make, but I'll come back to it if I remember it.
Right. Thank you very much. I think now, just to also let you know that on the panel, we had over 140 participants are listening to the panel. So thank you very much to the participants who took time off their schedules to actually listen to us and this important discussion. I think now I will go back to the panelists with this question, this last question, that each one can really speak to around, as you also conclude, you have some concluding remarks around some of the issues that we're discussing. So in summary, what is the key area of action UNODC should focus on in the next 5 years? In summary, what is the key area and action UNODC should focus on in the next 5 years? So I'll begin with the Honorable Ongudi and Prof. Lina Wangrat can come in, then Dr. Ina Kobe, then we will have Dr. Alexandra Bashon, then lastly, Jennifer can give us your thoughts. So if you can all give us some of your closing remarks, but also focusing on this one key question: what is the key area and action UNODC should focus on in the next 5 years? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Manasseh. In conclusion or in concluding, some of the key areas which UNODC should concentrate on the next 5 years. One, we have realized that a number of people do not know their rights. And that is why they are easily led into corruption and bribery. So we need awareness. And the concentration should be on the people who are inside there. Like in Kenya, I would say in the villages, maybe in Ghana, in the villages, and so on. Number two, data collection, so that we know exactly where we are standing in terms of the level of corruption in our countries. Number three, empowerment. Because what leads to women being led into some of these things is because of, they are not empowered. And they're easily swayed, thinking that when they do this, when they involve themselves in this kind of deals, they are going to profit. And then at the end of the day, they are brought to court together with the people they were trying to assist. And the law does not distinguish. Once you've committed an offense, you are punished for it. So that empowerment, I believe, is key. And of course, we would agitate for women also being given key roles in society, roles of leadership, so that they can also influence positively the people that they are serving. Thank you.
Okay, I build on this, and from a gender perspective, I would say that the most important thing to focus is on how to increase self-determination for women in their everyday life, economically, and also when it comes to bodily integrity. And lowering the level of corruption in countries will free money and resources to do this, I would say. So there is a clear link between corruption and self-determination for women in everyday life.
Okay, I also
Thank you
jump
very
into
much.
this. I agree also, of course, with empowerment, but I would also raise that it's in particular about economic empowerment. Actually, also what Lena said, that women are less dependent, in particular financially, from their partners, because then they also don't have to do specific things if they are more independent. We should have, of course, a stronger focus on norms and values, and as I said, as how we raise our kids, so to say. Like it starts at home, and who takes care of which parts, so to say, and there actually shouldn't be any traditional gender roles anymore. And also that we include more discussions and more education already in the kindergarten when we talk about dishonest behavior at schools and the universities, so that there are specific maybe seminars, sessions about gender equality, and also of course related to corrupt behavior and equal payment. I mean, there's still a very large gender pay gap, of course, and women should get the same salaries as men for the same job with same qualifications. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Since
much.
the question is, thank you. Since the question is directed at actions that UNODC should focus on, given that they're the custodians and the guardians of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, I think mainstreaming the discussion around women's empowerment and fighting corruption, or integrating these discussions, is really, really helpful. I think it's also important to focus specifically these messages to policymakers who work in the anti-corruption arena. A special session at the Conference of States Parties on gender and corruption, and inviting power brokers and policymakers to speak on the matter, I think would be a very helpful step.
Thank you. I believe it's now
Very
over
much.
to
Lastly,
me.
Jennifer.
Yes, thank you. So, you know, I want to say one thing, that is that complacency is corruption's best friend. Sitting back. It's always been this way. This is how it's done. No. Whether it's gender equality, whether it's stereotypes, whether it's corruption, or all in one nasty mess, we can't just accept it. You know, we've called, the time is now our call to action. One of the recommendations was, please, member states of the United Nations, recognize this. And look, now we have, from the UN's General Assembly special session against corruption, we actually have one paragraph. This is, people will say it's only one out of many, 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 but it is one, and it is there. And this is the difference that we have with other resolutions and so on, where this gender corruption interlinkages has not been found. I'm going to read it. Please bear with me. Member states have committed to, we will improve our understanding of the linkages between gender and corruption, including the ways in which corruption can affect women and men differently, and we will continue to promote gender equality, the empowerment of women, including by mainstreaming it into relevant legislation, policy development, research, projects and programs as appropriate and in accordance with the fundamental principles of domestic law. Now, there you go. That's our starting point. Some have called 2021 the anti-corruption year. And yeah, let's make the most of it. And yes, Alex, I'm with you. Let's have a side event at the Conference of the States Parties. Let's push. We need to push this. Blazing the trail has never been easy, but somebody's got to do it. And I am immensely honored to be doing it with this fantastic panel, and knowing that together we can make a difference because we're not complacent. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, with that call to action. And complacency is really the friend of corruption. For now, I'd like to thank the panelists for their insightful thoughts from their experiences and research, and some of the ideas that they've brought forward in terms of the way forward. I think now I would have to leave it to Hannah or Magda to say a few comments before we close the meeting. Thank you.
I just want to say this was such a rich discussion, and I'm really honored to have listened to you and gotten more ideas of how we could continue working in UNODC. So I would like to thank the panelists for their insights and expertise, and also Manessa for excellent moderation. And I really like the free-flowing discussion that we had. It really enriched us all. So thank you very much. And I hope also that we'll see many of the participants at tomorrow's panel also, where we discuss gender aspects in law enforcement and access to justice. So I wish you a great rest of the day. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.